But first, what's that saying? It never rains but it pours. Today in Melbourne, all of it kicked off early with an earthquake, one of the largest ever recorded along Australia's eastern coast. And then a long third day of union anti-vaxxer protests, culminating with a standoff at the Shrine of Remembrance on St Kilda Road, all ahead of tomorrow, when Melbourne claims the dubious title of the world's most lockdown city. It's in dispute, but that's where the numbers stand. Now, late this afternoon, media helicopters were grounded. An extraordinary move and denial of scrutiny from the media, but necessary, so we were told, because they didn't want police positions to be given away to protesters. Or perhaps it was because the images were going around the world, and none of this looks good for a government that's locked up 5 million plus citizens in the vain hope of COVID zero that's now turned out to be a fantasy, with the mental health and financial costs of the medicine far worse than the actual disease itself. Today I got dozens and dozens of messages from people who love Melbourne, but were dismayed at the scenes on the television screens. Many of them, opposed to protesting, they had a bit of sympathy for how the protesters feel. Now, no one's trying to say that breaking the law is justified. They are not, I am not. But as many indicated to me, they understand, they can appreciate just how broken and desperate some of the protesters feel, because many of the people contacting me say that they too feel the same way. Since the start of this pandemic, Melburnians have been locked in their homes under virtual house arrest for almost 8 months in cumulative terms. Kids haven't been at school, families separated, incomes hit, savings gone. And those that live alone, lonelier than ever. If you think you know what a lockdown does to your spirit, unless you live in Melbourne, I'm sorry, but you've got no idea. There's no outdoors beyond 2 hours of exercise. There's no sunshine on your face because everywhere you go, you've got to have a mask on. It isn't like Sydney with scenes of people sunbaking on the beach. Good luck to Sydney-siders. But in Melbourne, it's about as draconian as it gets in the police state of Daniel Andrews, Victoria. All the things that make Melbourne a great city to live in have been lost in this pandemic. There's live music's gone, the big crowds at Flemington, and to add insult to injury, this weekend too, for the second year running, the MCG will fall silent on grand final day, even as 2 Melbourne teams fight it out for the big prize. What's so brutal about all of this is that Victoria suffered like this last year, and the government swore it would be different.
We're not going to spend 2021 bouncing in and out of lockdowns.
And here we are, 7th week of our 6th lockdown. What a lie that was, Daniel Andrews. All through the media are images over the past few days of Melburnians taking to the streets, demanding that enough is enough. It doesn't matter how much the CFMEU and the Andrews government want to spin it all away and say otherwise. These protests started from inside the union movement, and having unleashed pent-up community anger, even amongst their own, Victoria's Labor government is struggling now to contain it. But it's not just me saying this. Today's Age newspaper, hardly a bastion of resistance to Daniel Andrews, reported this morning that up to 90% of yesterday's protesters really were tradies and building workers. Many CFMEU members deeply unhappy about mandatory vaccinations and really angry about having their industry closed down for 2 weeks, even though it's central to the economy. Despite being delayed for hours, lots of the drivers stuck on the Westgate Freeway yesterday didn't seem to think they were mostly neo-Nazis or un-Australian morons either, given all the tooting in support. Having gone AWOL yesterday at this graphic evidence that his own union power base is becoming fed up with living under a virtual health dictatorship, Andrews surfaced today at the unusual time of a press conference around 8 o'clock, no doubt hoping to get his lines out before serious journalists were there to ask questions. It was necessary, said the Premier, to close down construction for 2 weeks because there were 350 active COVID cases traceable to building sites.
And I am gutted to have to shut this industry down, but be in no doubt there are 350 cases in construction, over 150 different sites during August and September.
Now, typically, it was not his decision to shut up shop. said the Premier, but that of Victoria's Chief Health Officer, the lockdown-addicted Brett Sutton. But hang on, why is 350 cases a catastrophe in an industry that employs well over 320,000 people in Victoria alone? That's a case rate of 0.1%. 0.1%. But health concern isn't what this is about. It's about a Premier facing a challenge to his power from his own CFMEU power base, and he doesn't like it. He doesn't like it, and he wants to crush it. And I'll tell you what, you want to make vaccinations mandatory? Start with your own public servants, Premier. Start with the 322,000 of them you employ that still refuse to go back to their offices. And then all your political mates too. Demand that all the MPs in the Parliament are jabbed, and then open up the Parliament. Because this state needs to claw back some of the controls you've imposed and reinstate the freedoms you've stolen away. And have the Parliament sit again. Bring back the scrutiny again. I've long been amazed at the seemingly mesmeric hold this cult of Dan has over the state of Victoria, and the way so many Victorians have seemed cowed by this bloke. But it's got to be significant that the rank and file unionists, the type that Andrews has relied on for years to swamp polling booths, are now marching through the streets of Melbourne telling him to F off. I've been saying for nearly 12 months that something's very rotten in the state of Victoria. Truly. How long do you think Scott Morrison could have stayed on as Prime Minister if the Liberal Party was in administration and fighting cases through the courts, but somehow that just gets tolerated in Victoria? That's not just the start of the stink enveloping the state of Victoria, a state where the Premier can announce $1.3 billion last April for an extra 4,000 ICU beds, but now no beds, and no explanation as to where the money has gone.
I think April last year that former Minister Makakos announced 4,000 extra beds would be coming online. Do you know how many have been delivered since then?
No, hang on a minute. Hang on. That is not what she announced. The notion that we're going to have 4,000 beds down at, a warehouse somewhere, turn the exhibition buildings into an ICU unit, and then have a nurse at the foot of each of those beds practising hospital corners. No, that's not how it works.
Sorry, that was his own press release last April. If you're one of those commentators who's a slave to the polls, Dan Andrews still looks unassailable. I've been around in politics for a while, so did Kevin Rudd, just a month or so before he was torn down by his own colleagues. Will that be Andrews' fate? Well, we locked up Victorians can only hope, can't we?